name is Moses Milan. For many years, law enforcement officers have utilized a method of policing known as racial profiling in order to fight crime. However, despite widespread use by the police, this practice remains highly controversial. For many, racial profiling is just common sense police work. To others, racial profiling is a dangerous infringement on the rights and dignity of minority persons. Which one of these perspectives is the right one? Well, we're here today to find out. And with me, I have Dr. Pernell Witherspoon. Yeah. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So for the audience that will be watching, give us a real quick idea of your background on the topic.
Okay. Well, I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, a long time ago. Grew up in St. Louis. Went to college at Southeast Missouri State University. Joined the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. Worked undercover for some years. Moved to Atlanta, worked undercover some more, and moved back to St. Louis and completed my career as a sergeant in Hazelwood, Missouri. I'm married, have two beautiful children who are old now, and I joined Lindenwood University in 2005. And I will say that I enjoy my career, and how many people can say that they love their jobs? So that's pretty much my story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I want to start us off with a quote. This is Bradley Balco from the Washington Post. And he says, "I've had more than one retired police officer tell me that when it comes to racial profiling, it never happens and it works." Racial profiling exists. I think the point of contention is how we view it. A lot of people have very split ideas on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Do you think racial profiling is a legitimate tool for law enforcement, or do you think racial profiling is just plain wrong?
Okay. Well, the quick and easy answer to that is to go back to the legacy of racism in the United States. If we look at the history of racism in the United States, I can easily say that no, never should racial profiling be a tool used. But that leads to the definition of racial profiling. The definition of racial profiling in the criminology and criminal justice world is when you stop someone specifically because of their race and nothing else, race alone. So using that definition, using that working definition, I would have to say it's never appropriate to use as a tool in law enforcement or anywhere.
Okay, absolutely. Well, let's jump into some of the examples of racial profiling, because I think there's some nuance that we can break down, and
Okay.
I'd like to talk about that. I'll give you another quote. This is Sam Harris. He's a philosopher. He's had a lot to say about the subject of terrorism, and I'd like to talk first about profiling terrorists. This is what he had to say. "It is simply a fact that in the year 2012, suicidal terrorism is overwhelmingly a Muslim phenomenon. If you grant this, it follows that applying equal scrutiny to Mennonites would be a dangerous waste of time. If the goal of devout Muslims is simply to travel safely and efficiently, wouldn't they too want a system that notices people like themselves?" So I think if a Middle Eastern or Muslim person gets on a plane and they want to travel to another part of the country or world, if their primary motivation is traveling safely and efficiently, wouldn't they too want, as he says, a system that notices people like themselves?
I would imagine that they would want a system that notices people who are a danger to their ability to travel safely. Now, who are those people is the question. If we think specifically to the United States and issues with terrorism on aircrafts, it's pretty rare. We can go further and think about how many Muslims exist in the world. If we look at take the number of Muslims that exist in the world compared to those who actually commit terrorist acts, then what we essentially will be doing is taking those who are potentially innocent individuals and punishing them, by more searches than others, because of acts of a few over here. So if I was a Muslim person traveling, totally innocent, and trying to get to my destination and potentially running late like I do every now and then, I might have an issue, and I may not necessarily say, hey, it's okay to profile me because I'm Muslim. So I'd say no.
So no?
I'd say no.
Well, let me push back on that.
Okay.
Because you're absolutely right that the number of terrorist incidents is very low. But it only takes one.
Okay.
And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that Muslims are actually primarily the victims of Muslim terrorism.
Okay.
So I think they should want to be safe just like the rest of us, and I'm sure they do. So really, you're speaking of it in terms of fairness, and I do understand that. I'm trying to speak of it in terms of effectiveness. Is racially profiling people who resemble Muslims, generally Middle Eastern people, is that effective in stopping terrorism?
Well, again, we have to go back to that working definition in criminology and criminal justice. Racial profiling is stopping someone based on their race alone. Now, we have something that's called criminal profiling, okay? And that's putting together various characteristics to pinpoint who may potentially commit a certain act.
So you wouldn't be against race as a factor. You would be against race as the only factor. So you're not against a profile that includes race, as long as it includes other factors like age or an item that resembles a gun in someone's bag. But do you think even having that element of race in there is okay?
Well, it's difficult to say that race is okay because of the climate that we live in the United States. And because racism is so complex to pinpoint and today is really hidden. How many people will admit that they're stopping this individual because of his or her race alone compared to these other factors that really need to be put in place if we're going to say this is a tactic that's fairly used? And I'm going to use that word fair. And I have to use that word because we're talking about the United States of America. I'm not sure what the Constitution says in other countries, but in the United States, the 14th Amendment says that we all should be treated equally by law. So I have to use the term fair.
Okay. Well, I will talk about the fairness aspect of it, and here's how I think it's fair, and at least race being a part of that profile. Each ethnicity commits a different crime at a different rate, and each ethnicity commits their own individual crimes. Take school shootings, for instance, predominantly white crime. Serial killing, predominantly white crime. You have illegal immigration, predominantly Hispanic crime. Each ethnic group commits their own specific crimes at a higher rate than other ethnic groups. So is there nothing wrong with a cop factoring in race, especially when it's something where a crime, where it's statistically speaking, that person is much more likely to commit that crime because of their race?
I think it's fair. I think it's fair to factor in race if you have knowledge of those factors you just gave. Education is important. How many officers out there? And I have to tell you that still, according to most of the research, most law enforcement departments don't require anything more than a high school diploma. So that goes to education. Will officers or are officers out there on the street today armed with this knowledge that you just spoke of? You gave some pretty easy ones when we talk about Hispanics and immigration, but do officers really know that whites are more likely to commit these school shootings? Do they really know that? We make assumptions all the time.
So you think it relies on really an education of the police force?
I think experience is important as well, but I do believe education is important, especially when we're talking about criminal profiling and we're putting race in factors and we're trying to identify who does what.
Okay. I want to talk to you about something called anti-profiling. So racial profiling is where we single out certain people based on their race because of their statistical likelihood to commit more crime. That's the rough and short version. What about a system that doesn't single out people to be overly profiled? Instead, it singles out people who we're not going to pay any attention to. A good example of that would be older white women. Older white women don't commit very many acts of suicidal terrorism on airplanes. We can talk about why that is, but in the moment, that's the reality. What would be wrong with a system that really opts to more or less ignore people that fit that description because of their statistical likelihood, less likelihood to commit that kind of crime?
Well, we certainly don't want to waste resources on things or waste time on things. But then we do have to go back to that fairness idea. If the 14th Amendment says that we're all supposed to be treated equally, then I can't say that I'm for a system that says we're going to ignore this group of individuals. And it's tough. It's tough because we have our internal biases that we have to work through because we're human. And yes, would I be less likely to focus on an older white female? Absolutely. But do you know what? I know a little bit about research, and when we talk about racial profiling, and I'll tell you that back in 1989 or 1990, I took some courses with the DEA, and we were trained to look for the particular drug carrier in the United States as a Hispanic or black male. Okay, the criminological research I found out later with education shows that typically the person who's caught with drugs on these stops on our highways are more likely to be white. Sometimes older white females, believe it or not.
If they're more likely to be white, and I'm assuming that's true, would you be for profiling then people that fit that description, older and white?
Well, you'd have to still think about various characteristics. You can't just say older and white. That's not a criminal characteristic. There's going to have to be criminal characteristics for me to profile. And that profiling will not be racial profiling, it will be criminal profiling.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to read another quote. And I want to turn more to the inner city aspect of the discussion. In the inner cities, there's a lot of tension between law enforcement and black folks. Much of this tension is based on the fact that there's at least a perception, and I believe a reality, that police profile, sometimes criminally, sometimes racially, profile black folks. Are black Americans right to resent this kind of treatment?
Well, when you say, are black Americans right to resent that type of treatment, certainly if the treatment is unwarranted. But something that many don't know is that most blacks actually do look at their local police officers in a positive light. Many of us assume that most blacks dislike police, including a large percentage of police. And that creates a problem of distrust and sometimes mistrust between many in the black community and the police. So that perpetuates this problem that you're speaking of. So only if that treatment is unwarranted should blacks feel, hey, this is not right. But there's also research that shows that if you're stopped by the police, there's something called procedural justice. If you're stopped by the police and you're treated appropriately, you have no beef. It's all good. So it's all about how people are being treated, to answer that question.
So do you think that black Americans should accept a certain level of race being a factor in say being pulled over? Do you think that there should be an acceptance that there is a higher rate of crime, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and therefore there's going to be more scrutiny placed on black communities as opposed to white communities? Do you think that that's acceptable to black folks?
Well, given that most blacks do have confidence in the police, I would say that many of them have accepted that. Otherwise, there would be more turmoil than we see out here. And you think about a lot of these protests. There's a larger percentage of blacks who aren't protesting these various police shootings than there are who protest. You know, take St. Louis City. I can't remember the population of blacks in St. Louis City, but if you look at many of the marches, there's a whole lot of other blacks who didn't participate in those marches. I can't say what their motives were, but given some of the research that says that most blacks do appreciate the police, then certainly, you know, that answers your question.
Okay. Well, I'd like to read the quote. And it's by David French, who's more conservative leaning. And this is what he had to say. A population that's more likely to engage in violent crime is more likely to encounter the police in dangerous and fraught circumstances. The vast majority of black men are law-abiding, but black men are still far more likely to commit violent crimes such as murder or armed robbery than whites. Tell me what you think about it. It really is a fact that there are higher rates of violent crime in black communities. How should the police view this? And importantly, if the police are really doing their job to stop violent crime, if they're really doing their job, isn't it really inevitable that more attention is going to be paid to black communities as opposed to white communities?
Well, certainly there's going to be more attention in crime-ridden areas, and the research definitely shows that you're going to find more crime and violent crime in black communities. The problem when we speak to racial profiling is that the places that show the largest disparities when it comes to black stops compared to white stops are in predominantly white communities, which is problematic. So we can speak to the black crime issue in the inner city.
Why do you think that's problematic?
Which part?
Being stopped in white communities.
In white communities. Well, what you said earlier was that it's a fact that most blacks are law-abiding. So if you're in an area where the percentage of blacks are far fewer, then why are they being stopped in these areas? You know, that's problematic. You know, you have a population of 2%. And let's say Clayton, Missouri. Sorry, Clayton, Missouri, that I'm saying Clayton, Missouri. But let's say Clayton, Missouri. 2% of blacks live in Clayton, Missouri. But there's a stop index compared to whites that may be, 8-to-1. In fact, well, I won't put Clayton out there like that, but people know what I'm trying to say.
Well, let me talk a little bit about the New Jersey study.
Okay.
So there was a big outcry when it was found that the New Jersey Police Department were pulling over blacks in disproportionate numbers to whites. Mm-hmm. So the state of New Jersey commissioned a study, and they said, we're going to look at who speeds more, who offends more, and then we're going to compare those rates of offending and speeding to the rates of arrest. And they found that, yes, blacks were more pulled over than white people were, but they were also offending more. They were speeding more. They were more likely to drive a car with an out taillight or other things like that. So, and the study was done twice because they did it once, they got that result, and they thought it was so outlandish that they threw it out and redid it, and same result. So do you think blacks are being pulled over in disproportionate numbers because of cops that are racially profiling them in a pernicious way? Or do you think it's just because blacks tend to be lower income, and then that's a big indicator of who does get pulled over? Without taillights, you're speeding, you're late to work. These are problems rich people don't necessarily have, and poor people have more, and black people tend to be, on average, poor. So do you think that's because of racism, or do you think that's just the cops doing their job?
Well, it would be irresponsible for me to say that I think it's because of racism, because that's something I can't prove. However, we can look at patterns that exist. And that's what a lot of these racial profiling studies do. Even though they found this to be the case in New Jersey, you'd have to separate equipment violations to get at the poverty issue that you speak of, to true what people call speeding violations, or true traffic violations such as speeding and stop signs and things of that nature. So if we look at that study, what percentage of those who were stopped that were black were actually stopped for equipment violations such as tail lights and things of that nature. And the Supreme Court said that police can stop people for these even if they're trying to investigate something different. But we can't get into the psyche of that officer and say that, okay, this is a legitimate stop by law, but to the person who was actually stopped for this tail light, who probably considered to be a minor traffic violation, is that really a legitimate stop? What might their conclusion be almost every time? You stopped me because I'm black. Can we prove that? No. Can we disprove it as well? You know? So I can't make any assumptions on that. I have to look at what the research indicates on these various things. Now, certainly I can't make some assumptions based on my education, but I have to be able to explain it as well.
Right. Yeah. Let's turn back to violent crime.
Okay.
So studies have shown, and basically all the studies have shown, that probably half of the violent crime in this country is committed by black people, generally against black people, but at the same time by black people.
Okay.
Whites commit around a third of violent crime. However, when the number of whites who are shot each year by the police is exactly the same as the number of blacks, if the main thing that will get you shot by a cop is if you are involved in a violent crime, isn't that, if anything, isn't that discrimination against white people?
Okay. I'm sure some would think that, and that's actually a good question. But if you look at the research, actually blacks are shot and killed by the police at higher rates than whites. But whites are shot more often than blacks. But here's my point. When we look at what you call at-risk behavior, which someone's committing a murder or robbery or something like that, whites are actually shot at slightly higher rates than blacks. In other words, that shooting is justifiable. Here's the problem. The shootings of blacks that are questionable. Okay? So when you look at the whites being shot by police, many of those shootings are legitimate shootings. But there's a larger percentage of blacks who are being shot by the police for other reasons that are questionable. And that's why you're seeing many of the marches in various cities.
Do you think that's true, or do you think that when a white person is shot for questionable reasons, it doesn't get the attention that a black person? I'll bring up, there was a guy actually in my hometown, a guy named, I believe Tyler Teasley was his name. He was a kid, he was drunk driving, and a cop told him to get out of his car, and he didn't do it, and instead he hit reverse, and the cop pulled his gun and killed him. No one heard about that. It wasn't national news, it wasn't anything like that. Daniel Shaver was a very similar story. He was at a party. He was overage. He was drinking, but he was 21. The cops gunned him down when he was verbally begging for his life, on his knees, hands in his air, begging for his life. The cops killed him. No one ever heard about that. So your point that police tend to be to shoot blacks unfairly, don't you think there are a lot of instances where whites are shot unfairly, but it doesn't get the attention, it doesn't get the coverage, they don't have groups and people advocating for them? Do you think that's fair to assume?
I think it is fair to assume, because
do you
police
think there are whites who are shot unfairly and they don't get the attention? Or
Absolutely. I believe that to be true. Police are human and they do make mistakes. Will the police report read that way? Not necessarily sure. But yes, they do make mistakes. But also remember, you're in the United States of America. And when we speak to racial issues, and there's some history behind the black community and policing. So why don't we have an uproar? Why don't we have protests when there's a white person perceivably shot unfairly by the police? Who's going to protest? Why don't the whites protest? There's nothing historically in our history about those relationships between police and whites.
So would it be fair to assume that you think that there's a weaker there's not really an identity among whites, whether there's a black collective a consciousness that really makes them aware of these things, whereas whites really don't care. So I'm trying to put that in a way. Do you think whites just don't care about other whites?
I don't think that. I don't believe.
Well,
that
not generally.
I don't believe that. I think I know what you're trying to say. I don't believe that to be true. I think that those instances are so infrequent. You just talked about a couple of cases, and if I was to match the cases where whites were, questionably shot by the police to the number of cases where blacks were questionably shot by the police, you're probably going to find a higher percentage over here with blacks. And if we go back to the 1940s and go back even further, we will have even larger problems with that. So I don't believe that whites don't care about this issue. It probably just doesn't ring as loud as it does in the black community because of historical factors.
Let me give one last quote. And this is by Art Acevedo, who I'm sure you've heard about. This is what he had to say. The vast majority of cops will never shoot anybody, shoot at anybody, or beat anybody. They will serve with honor and distinction. That being said, we still need to hold the few that fall short accountable. In closing the segment, can you give the viewers an idea, with or without racial profiling, with or without criminal profiling, whatever you want to call it, you're going to have bad cops. What do regular, ordinary people, what can they do to hold bad cops accountable?
That's a good question. Something we'd have to make a determination on is, what is a bad cop? We talk about this in one of my classes. One of our textbooks read that roughly 70% of police officers claim that they will not tell on their fellow officer if they witness this officer steal something from a citizen. Is that a bad cop? Some students say, yes, that's a bad cop. You're supposed to protect and serve. You're supposed to have high morals and things of that nature. Other students say, well, there's this subculture that exists, and there is research that talks about the subculture in policing, where you have to fit in. And so it's difficult to navigate through these things that you see with what may be a corrupt police officer, and you telling on that police officer, and the rest of the police say, hey, you're a snitch. And some of the unwritten rules in policing is that, if you tell on your fellow officer, what's going to happen when you need help one day? Right.
Well, I think there's something to be said for loyalty, but I don't think that should ever cover over the justice and the responsibility that police officers need to give to.
But there are realities that we live in. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we all want to fit in.
Sure.
And that's no different for a police officer.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, with that, we are out of time. Folks, I hope you enjoyed our conversation. I know I did. And have a great day, and tune in sometime soon. Thank you.